everyone has heard of the 10 Commandments, the list of thou shalt nots found in the Bible. Jesus saw in these commandments not onerous burdens, but guardrails and guideposts designed to help us experience the good and beautiful life. Words that set safe boundaries, create order out of chaos, help communities live peacefully, and protect us, often from ourselves. Every thou shalt not was intended to point to a life-giving thou shalt. These ancient words were given by a loving God who longed to protect us from harm while pointing toward the keys to a deeply meaningful and joyful life. Join us as we read the 10 Commandments through the eyes of Jesus.
There are some of the 10 Commandments that feel really easy to dismiss. When you first glance at them, well, you may imagine that some of the commandments, they don't apply to you. Here at Sycamore Creek, we have some awesome people. And in particular, you might think this about the commandment we're going to address today: do not steal. There's no way, right, that this will be helpful to us or even relate to us. Do not steal? We're not a bunch of thieves. Hold that thought. Because what I think we will find today, and what we've been finding each week as we've been studying the 10 Commandments, is that each of these guidelines or guardrails for life are a shorthand. There's a depth of meaning and impact to each of the commandments. They're telling us something about what God's will and God's expectations are for every single one of us. There's a depth of these commandments that we get to through the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, but there's even more depth when we get to the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus. And so as we listen today to Jesus and what he says about the commandments, well, Jesus tends to take these commandments, right, and flip them on their heads and not just tell us to avoid something, but Jesus gives us something positive to do. So today we're going to be talking about the commandment to not steal, and we'll move toward justice. And maybe God has something to say to you today about stealing. But first, let's quickly review the commandments we've covered so far and the main positive word behind each commandment. We've asked you to memorize the commandments as we go, so let's see how you do with them. Will you say these with me? You must have no other gods before me. That's faith. Do not make an idol for yourself. That's trust. Do not use the Lord your God's name as if it were of no significance. That's integrity. Remember the Sabbath day and treat it as holy. That's rest. Honor your father and mother. That's family. Do not kill. That's love. Do not commit adultery. That's faithfulness. Let's take a moment and pause on what we've covered so far in this series. Here's a question for you for discussion. How are you doing with memorizing the 10 Commandments? I'll invite you to take a moment and to work on reviewing them together. Let's pause a moment and do that. Today we come to another very short commandment: do not steal. In fact, in Hebrew, this command is only 2 words long. That's it. Do not steal is largely an economic commandment. When we say do not steal, we're talking about property, and we're talking about financial resources. And in addressing stealing, today we are going to talk about justice, and in particular, economic justice. We'll talk about how we're meant to view the stuff we have and the kinds of problems this commandment was meant to address in the ancient world, and well, what all this means for us today. There's a temptation we all face today to think or even say with this topic, well, that doesn't apply to me. But I hope by the end of today, every single one of us will be convicted in some way to not steal. Now, the foundation of do not steal is this: we're responsible for the human and economic flourishing of those around us. We're responsible for each other. It's not every person for themselves. That's never what God intended. We share responsibility. That's a key to this commandment. Now, if we recognize our common humanity, all created in the image of God, we will recognize the interconnectedness of everything. We flourish most when our neighbor flourishes too. In the Old Testament context, part of what this commandment means and what it's addressing was the kidnapping of human beings. It's stealing a life. And that may sound strange to think about, kidnapping of a human being, until we realize that still today we have things like human trafficking. We recognize that still today there are vulnerable people who are exploited and used by others. And some of these people, well, they're trafficked in the sex trade. Some people are moved across borders and their lives are controlled through the crossing of borders. A huge part of human trafficking is crossing borders. That's true here in the United States, where some people live in fear of being caught and exposed because they don't have the proper paperwork. And there's a kind of slavery, and I use that word provocatively and on purpose, that continues to happen today through human trafficking. Not just in the United States, but around the world. Kidnapping of people, the exploiting of people, and taking advantage of their lack of power or status, it continues to happen today. Now, you might not do this yourself. Maybe you haven't been a part of human trafficking or the exploitation of migrant workers, but if you are not actively resisting and speaking out against this, you're part of it. You see, not actively participating is not enough. We're all responsible for the human and economic flourishing of those around us. If you go back to ancient Egypt, where the people of Israel were enslaved, that story begins with Joseph and his brothers. Joseph was disliked by his brothers, so he was sold as a slave to the Ishmaelites who brought him to Egypt. And this idea of kidnapping people and selling them into slavery, in this case by his brothers, is something that we see throughout the Bible. It's something the Israelites were very familiar with. And to be clear, the buying and trading of human beings, it's not okay. It's wrong. In fact, Exodus is pretty clear, saying kidnappers must be put to death, whether they are caught in possession of their victims or have already sold them as slaves. Exodus 21 points us towards stealing that has to do with stealing people, and we're responsible too if we allow it to happen. In Deuteronomy, we read, if anyone kidnaps a fellow Israelite and treats them as a slave or sells him, the kidnapper must die. In this way, you will purge the evil among you. It's pretty clear. Kidnapping into slavery or trafficking is horrific, and it's so easy to think, well, I don't do that. But again, the point God makes to us, and this is the very basis of loving your neighbor, is that we're responsible for the human and economic flourishing of those around us. We are in this life together. Flourishing is not an individual event, it is communal. And the opposite of flourishing is exploitation. Now, exploitation, it's way more than just kidnapping or trafficking. Within Scripture, economic exploitation had to do with when employers weren't paying their employees an adequate wage. Most of the people who owned land, well, they had people who worked the land for them, and they were expected to pay them for the work that they provided. Many times, though, the landowner would withhold the wages from their workers or pay them subpar wages. So we read in the New Testament, but also in the Old Testament, that wages matter. James wrote this in the New Testament. He says, pay attention, you wealthy people. Consider the treasure that you have hoarded in the last days. Listen, hear the cries of the wages of your field hands. These are the wages you stole from those who harvested your fields. The cries of the harvester have reached the ears of the Lord of heavenly forces. You've lived a self-satisfying life on this earth, a life of luxury. You have stuffed your hearts in preparation for the day of slaughter. Now, it's interesting, this passage was written by James and addressed to Christians in a church. These were wealthy followers of Jesus, and James says to them, look, you haven't been paying your people an adequate wage. And by not paying your people an adequate wage, you've gotten rich while they've gotten poor and are struggling. We're responsible for the human and economic flourishing of those around us. Let's think about this in terms of today. There's a lot of debate right here in the United States about economic inequality. There are lots of directions we could go with this debate. One example is today that we find the highest paid people, the CEOs, are making huge salaries, many times more than the lowest paid employees in their company. And this inequality has grown out of control. It's way worse than it was 30 to 40 years ago. Today, the 500 richest people on earth make more than the poorest 2.5 billion people. That's staggering. And the gap between the richest and poorest has worsened over the past few decades. Throughout Scripture, the prophets warn God's people about this. They consider this stealing or cheating from the employees and from the poor to not pay them well. And this begs the question still today, are we paying our employees a living wage? Do we pay an appropriate wage? Are we even thinking about these things? We've been wrestling with this here at Sycamore Creek at the church leadership level as we've examined our pay of our staff, because this is important stuff. And my hope and my hunch is that if you're a part of Sycamore Creek Church and you're a management or leadership position in your business, that you're asking these questions too, and you're wrestling with this as well. Why? Because we're responsible for the human and economic flourishing of those around us. Now, maybe you haven't kidnapped anyone. Maybe you're not a CEO. Maybe you're more at the bottom of the income scale than at the top. The thing is, whether you determine employee wages at your workplace or not, we're all in this together. We're responsible for each other. So maybe how this does play out for us is how we buy things. Many of us buy things because they're cheap. And maybe some of the things that we buy are inexpensive because, well, they were made in a sweatshop where people work in subhuman conditions. And maybe we buy lower cost products from companies that exploit their workers. And maybe we sell things to someone else that we know aren't a good investment for them, but, well, because it makes us money, we do it anyway. Here's the thing. You may not pay the wages for many people, but if you have the means to choose what you buy, you're shaping the earnings and wages of people around you. Your economic choices, where and how you spend your money, they impact real people around you all the time. And that trickles on to the CEOs and the executives and how we treat people and how we treat workers. And I want to give a plug here. If you have the means, buy local. Buy things, even things that cost more, from people that you know, because we're responsible for the human and economic flourishing of those around us. Which brings us to another discussion question. Where do you see your own choices impacting the economic flourishing of people around you? Let's take a moment and discuss that. Your economic choices matter. The foundation of this commandment, do not steal, is that we sink or swim economically together. And here's another layer to do not steal. We're responsible for our neighbor's stuff. And maybe you've heard the phrase, finders, keepers, how does it go? Losers, weepers, right? Finders, keepers, losers, weepers. Where did we learn that anyway? Is that a good ethic for us to live by? If we stop and think about it, I hope most of us would emphatically say, no, that's not a good idea. And yet I'd also guess that most of us do in some way say, I found it, no one else around me is claiming it, it's mine. I hope that none of you walk around looking for things lying in the open and think, well, that person should have been smart enough to put it away or take better care of it. It's mine now. In that extreme case, I think we see the problem of finders, keepers, losers, weepers. We realize that if we find something that's lost, we try to return it to the person it belongs to. We make an effort not to take what's not ours, but to protect and return what belongs to others. There are a lot of ways we cut corners, though, on this idea where we're responsible for our neighbor's stuff. In Exodus, it says, when you happen to come upon your enemy's ox or donkey that has wandered off, you should bring it back to them. When you see a donkey that belongs to someone who hates you and it's lying down under its load and you are inclined not to help set it free, you must set it free. When it comes to our neighbor's stuff, this is the standard that God lays out for us. Help your enemy and return their possessions. Even your enemy. Help the person who hates you by helping their donkey. Even the person who hates you. And you may know that Jesus takes this even further and says, love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you. This is the opposite of finders keepers that most of us have drifted toward. Most of us have drifted away from the principles of do not steal. And what these verses from Exodus point to is that we are responsible for our neighbor's stuff. We return things to others. We return things to others. We return things to others, no matter who they are. There's one commandment that Jesus gives to us that seems to capture all of this, and it's what we often call the golden rule. And my guess is that you know it. Do you know it? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. In the first century, at the time of Jesus, the other rabbis talked about a rule that was really similar to this. And well, you'll find a rule that's something like this in just about every major religion, but almost always it goes something like this. Don't do to other people what you don't want them to do to you. It's a good idea, isn't it? Don't do to other people what you don't want them to do to you. If someone else finds something of yours, well, you don't want them to keep it, do you? You want them to return it to you, obviously. But Jesus takes this a step further. He states positively, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Whoever you are, whoever they are, whatever they've done to you, do what you would have them do to you. Do you see the difference? It's a much higher bar. It's not just avoiding something, it's doing something. We're to continually go the extra mile for another person. It's a simple rule that we espouse as a church, to do good. Now, I sometimes don't pay careful enough attention when I'm spending money in a convenience store, and you may know I have a weakness for cutie donuts. I love to go in there and I get myself a donut, and well, sometimes I hand the cashier too much money, and I love it when the employees, particularly Barb, notices this and she gives me the excess back. I probably won't notice, but when they do, it feels really good to me. It feels great when you lose something and someone goes through the effort of returning your wallet or your ID or your credit card or your phone back to you. Wow, it's profoundly grateful. It's a lesson in honesty and integrity and character. How do you handle other people's stuff? Maybe you think you don't steal, but I guarantee you will be and have been faced with choices about if, when, and how to return an item to someone else. And the questions we need to ask about our neighbor's stuff include, how much is your character worth? How much is your integrity worth? Let's pause a moment to discuss this idea of caring for other people's stuff. In what ways have you or can you take responsibility for other people's stuff? Let's discuss that. We're responsible for our neighbor's stuff. And this responsibility impacts our character. Are you living your life with an ethic that the people around you are inspired by? Are you striving to do the right thing? Or are you poised and ready to pounce on someone else's misfortune or their mistake? Do not steal means we don't take what is not ours. And we're here finally to the actual act of stealing that most of us think about when we hear about stealing. And this sort of thing happens on a pretty regular basis all around us. You leave the bike in the front yard and someone takes it. You leave your car unlocked and someone goes in and rifles through it for whatever they can find. And it's really easy to say, I would never do that. And again, maybe you're not a kidnapper. Maybe you're not a super rich CEO. Maybe you don't walk around picking up stuff that doesn't belong to you in other people's yards. But have you ever shared a password with someone else to get access to online content that you didn't pay for? Have you ever shared a TV provider password or maybe a Netflix account password? Have you ever downloaded music or videos that weren't yours? Maybe. Or maybe you fudged a little on your taxes. Do you claim all your income that was income? I'll be honest, this is super easy for a pastor to do. I often get paid extra for things like weddings or for funerals. Do I report that income to the IRS or not? And here's the question I need to ask myself in those moments. What is my integrity and my character worth? This doesn't have to do with what's legal or illegal. It doesn't have to do with what the IRS knows or doesn't know. But it has everything to do with God knowing. God knows my heart. God knows my doings. And God would know if I was dishonest. Or maybe you go to sell a car and you know there's something wrong with the car. Do you share what's wrong with it with the person who's thinking about buying it? It'll certainly impact the sales price to fully disclose the problems with the car. What do you do? What's your integrity and your character worth? Or what about stealing credit? We can take credit from others for things that they've done the hard work on. At Sycamore Creek, we try to always openly acknowledge that our sermon series are based on books or on other people's sermons. In the case of today, our sermon series is from the content from Church of the Resurrection in Leawood, Kansas. And the message today, it was originally from Pastor Adam Hamilton. He did most of the work of writing this message. Now I've taken it and I've adapted it and I've made it my own, but he did the bulk of the work. Do I tell you that? Or do I try to pretend that this is all my sermon with all my ideas and all my analysis of do not steal? Now Adam says in his message, he says, use my content, you don't even need to ask. But give credit where credit is due, not because I need it, but for your own character and integrity. Or imagine negotiating a deal. We value here in the US putting the screws to someone and negotiating as hard as we can. There are some people who love this, not me. But it's like a game or a competition to see who can get the best deal. And I get this, but this also leads to a desire to win at all costs. And the problem is that sometimes the person or organization on the other side, well, they're stuck in a poor bargaining position. The possibility is there for us to take advantage of their problems or their financial hardships and to use it for our gain. Do not steal. It's being a good negotiator, but finding a deal that works for both parties. How hard do you push to get the best possible deal for yourself? And what harm can you cause to someone else? And now we are well into the nuances of do not steal. I want to challenge you today that God is calling us to a higher ethic. We're being called to a higher standard of living through this commandment. God is saying to us, I don't care what anybody else does. What I care about is what you do. How are you living your life? We don't take what's not ours. Jesus begins his first sermon with these words, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor." The good news for the poor is all of us doing to others as we would have them do unto us. It's treating others with character and integrity and respect, the way we would want to be treated. It's going the extra mile to help others. It's constantly seeking economic justice, because when we all flourish, we all flourish. Now, there are several points where Jesus dealt with thieves during his ministry. One of them is the parable of the Good Samaritan. A man was beaten and left for dead by, thieves. And two religious people come by, and for a variety of reasons, they don't stop and help, they move on. And in that moment, they stole the help from that man that God wanted them to give. You see, there are sins of commission, where we do something wrong by stealing. There are also sins of omission, where we steal by not doing the good things that we're capable of doing. This is convicting to me, and I hope to you too. The week before Jesus died, he went through Jericho and encountered a tax collector. This guy was the chief tax collector, and he put the screws to the people around him. He was taking more money than what he was owed. This was a common practice in those days. Everybody was doing it. This man, his name was Zacchaeus, and Jesus came to the tree that he had climbed, and he said, "Zacchaeus, come down, for I want to eat with you." Listen to Zacchaeus' response. Zacchaeus stopped and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anyone, I repay them 4 times as much." Zacchaeus recognized that he had cheated people, and he's going to make it right. He gets and understands, do not steal. And then there's a final encounter that Jesus has on the cross. There are 2 men who are crucified with him, and one of the theories is that these men were in some way thieves. I don't know if they were, but it works to think about this as we wrap up this sermon today. And one of the men on the cross hurls insults at Jesus, and in contrast, the other one says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied to that guy, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Jesus forgave that thief. And when it comes to Jesus and thieves, what I hope you recognize today is that, I'm a thief too. I've stolen in some of the ways we've covered today, and my guess is you have too. I've shared passwords, I've pushed for deals that benefit me, and my guess is you have too. I've taken advantage of others' economic circumstances without a thought, and my guess is you have too. The bottom line is that when it comes to these commandments to do not steal, we've all left the guardrails from time to time. We are all thieves. We've all stolen from each other. We've all stolen from God. But today, just like that man on the cross next to Jesus, we can, through Jesus, be forgiven. I want to invite you today to repent. Repenting is turning away from where we've gone wrong, and it's embracing God. And as we embrace God today, I want to challenge you to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Do that with their stuff. Do that with their time. Do that with their flourishing. And know that when you blow it, and you will, remember and receive the generous forgiveness that we have through Jesus. Let's work together toward flourishing. Amen.